All right, I think we're going to get started. So welcome to our webinar, Plastics Under Scrutiny, Understanding a New Era of Corporate Liability. I'm Rebecca Stern, Chief Science Officer at Dunya Analytics, and I'm going to be moderating today's webinar. We're so glad you're joining us today for what should be a very engaging conversation. We are recording this session and we'll share it afterwards. Let's start first with having each of our speakers introduce themselves and their organizations. Megan, Loes, and then Françoise.
Thanks, Rebecca. Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining. My name is Megan Pillsbury. I'm the founder and CEO of Dunya Analytics. And at Dunya Analytics, we make it easy for companies to connect the dots between what's happening in nature and the environment with corporate financial impacts. So we do automate the TNFD leap approach, if you're familiar with that, but we've built our platform for action. So it really enables you to see how nature is creating impacts and dependencies for your organization, and build a business case for action and embed nature into everyday business decisions to build resilience. All right, Loes, over to you.
Nice. Yeah, so my name is Loes. I'm based in Amsterdam. I founded Climate Court, where I track and analyze climate litigation updates, but I draw that definition very broad, so I also follow biodiversity and plastics. I started Climate Court because there was initially not a lot of coverage from about cases from the Global South in particular. And there's also in this space, there's a huge us versus them situation going on. And I have a background in corporate law, so I very comfortably sit between plaintiffs and defendants. And I think we need more dialogue and understanding as to what's going on in court, what the NGOs are up to, what they're looking at, and why companies act the way they do or at the pace that they do. And then through this, I also began advising NGOs and companies on these matters.
Hi, I'm Françoise, co-founder and CEO of Pack to Earth. We're a Barcelona-based impact company, and we specialize in formulating and selling materials which compost at ambient temperature, yet are good for packaging products which have a long shelf life. So this is probably the hardest category of fossil plastic to replace in food packaging. It's the high barrier home compostable materials that we specialize in.
Great. Thank you so much, everyone. We are about to start off with a poll, which I'll launch in a second. And then I'm going to provide a brief overview of the plastics crisis and emerging litigation and regulation. And then we will turn to our panelists. Today's format is a bit relaxed. We're going to have questions to guide our conversation. And I also want to invite our panelists to jump in at any point of the discussion. And for everyone who's attending, please feel free to submit questions via the Q&A, and we'll pull some of those into the discussion along the way, or we'll also have time for Q&A at the end. So let me launch our first poll, which is, how familiar are you with plastics as a liability risk? So the answer choices are, I hadn't thought about it in those terms, or I was aware of it, but I don't really know the details. I've been following this closely, or it is directly relevant to my work. We'll give everyone a minute to finish that up, and I'm going to share my screen again for my background information. And great, we've got some votes coming in. Maybe I can just leave that up. Well, oh, we got 65%. Okay, we'll give it one more minute. And then I'll get started with the background. So, all right, we got so far a lot of votes for aware but don't know the details. So that's great. Okay, I think I will pause the poll. I can figure out how. Maybe I can't see it because I'm sharing my screen. There we go. Okay. Are you able to see the results yet? Can you see the poll results or not yet?
Yeah. Well, I can't see them on our side, but I can see them in the poll section.
Oh, here we go. Okay, here we go. Results. So most are aware but don't know the details, and some hadn't thought about it in those terms, and then some for the other two as well, following closely and directly relevant. So that's great. Seems like we have a really great array of attendees, and we look forward to your contributions in the Q&A as well. All right, so let's get started with some background. So plastics, of course, have an unparalleled combination of being very durable, lightweight, and hygienic. As a byproduct of fossil fuel energy production, they're also very inexpensive. This graph shows the production of plastics starting in 1950s. It goes 1950 up to 2019 here. And rapid growth of plastic production started in the 1950s. And since then, plastic really has revolutionized packaging, medicine, and manufacturing. However, in terms of the scale of the problem, first of all, they are made from petrochemicals, byproduct of the fossil fuel industry. And globally, almost 90% of plastic is not recycled. And just in the last 2 decades, as you can see, plastic production has more than doubled. And even more than that, the production of plastics is expected to triple by 2060. So the problem is not only the scale of production, but also the management of plastic waste. So what happens once plastic is in the environment? It takes between 100 to over 1,000 years to decompose. And during that time, it fragments into smaller and smaller pieces, microplastics and even smaller nanoplastics, which are tiny enough to penetrate tissues and cells. And both micro and nanoplastics are found in every ecosystem on the planet. For wildlife, microplastics can be very dangerous. For example, when they're eaten, they easily accumulate inside the animal's body and cause serious health issues. Scientists have found that microplastics also harm plants and soil. They even change the flow of water and nutrients and the array of organisms that live in the soil. But what is starting to get even more attention now, aside from the environmental impacts, are the major implications for human health. So we humans, we're exposed to microplastics through ingesting it, inhaling it, and also through our skin. Nanoplastics and micro and nanoplastics have been found in human lung, kidney, liver, and brain tissues, and also in placentas. Many chemicals found in plastic products are endocrine disruptors. And that can lead to numerous health risks, including cancer and infertility. And there's one study that examined 16 types of commonly consumed proteins. This included beef, shrimp, and tofu, and found microplastics present in 90% of the samples. So our focus today, of course, is on business. Why does this matter for business? If you use plastic in your business, your company may increasingly be exposed to financial risk. And I have some examples here on this slide of claims that are being actively litigated. On the left, these cases apply to the producers of plastic. So one example, petrochemical and fossil fuel companies created the plastic crisis and knew recycling could never solve it, yet they promoted recycling anyway, is one of the claims. And also that selling plastic while knowing it cannot be recycled is being treated now as misrepresentation and not as just a flawed recycling system. And then the ones on the right, these examples apply to companies that didn't produce the plastic, but use it in their products. And so claims are that companies can't shift the burden to consumers for a recycling system, again, that the companies knew was never going to work. And also that failure to disclose that products leach microplastics during normal use, that's being treated as a material safety omission. And a lot of this is straight out of the tobacco and climate litigation playbooks, allegations of coordinated deception through industry trade associations. There are more examples of this as well. So along with Climate Court, yesterday we published an article on this topic describing these major legal cases. This has been uploaded to this webinar. It's also available on our website, and we'll also include it in our follow-up email after the webinar. So as mentioned in the climate and tobacco playbooks, we have seen this before with tobacco, asbestos, and PFAS. Of course, PFAS, or forever chemicals, these are deeply part of the plastic pollution crisis because these chemicals are, they're toxic and they're additives to plastic production, and they create hazardous pollution in our environment. But in all three categories of these categories, companies concealed risk that they knew about, and they shifted the responsibility elsewhere. And we may get more into this depending on where our discussion goes. And then just to touch on regulation, this is not by any means an exhaustive list of emerging plastics regulation, but we did want to mention it. Over 100 countries have introduced plastic regulations, from bans on single-use bags all the way to extended producer responsibility schemes that makes manufacturers and brand owners physically or financially responsible for the entire life cycle of their product, particularly end-of-life disposal and recycling. And then there are some leading regions across the globe. So the EU has in 27 countries has single-use bans and 2030 recycling targets. Canada's ban on 6 categories of single-use plastics, and China, which is phasing out non-degradable bags and straws. An international plastics treaty to end plastic pollution is currently stalled, but a new chair was just elected this past February, and the idea is to revive that process. So to start our discussion off, Megan, thinking about what I mentioned in the background, can you start us off? Like, what does this all mean for companies?
Yeah, thanks, Rebecca. So as somebody who thinks about nature-related financial risk all the time, we definitely look at plastics as one of the many areas of nature that companies need to now pay more attention to and develop better governance about. So Rebecca did a great job kind of touching on some different aspects of those risks, obviously the first being legal risk. And we'll go into more depth with Loes on the topic of legal risk. But why now? Like, why is legal risk becoming an increasing problem for plastics right now? Well, one, as Rebecca pointed out, the volumes are huge. In 2025, it's estimated that we've produced between 400 and 500 million metric tons of plastic. And for me, metric tons are very hard to get my head around. That is 450 or 400 to 500 billion kilos of plastics that were produced in 2025. And if you think about that being produced every year, and there's also, I mean, it's stated in fossil fuel companies' strategic plans for addressing the reduction of fossil fuel use, they're planning to shift more to plastics production. So there's actually a ramp up of more plastics production as a way to make up that revenue, which is exacerbating the kind of plastics crisis that we have. So one, the volumes are huge. Two, now the impacts are being measured. There's so much plastic in the environment that the impacts to the environment are extremely obvious. And now we're concerned about and starting to measure the impacts to human health. And unfortunately, kind of how our courts work is they don't, at least in the US, they're not so inclined if you haven't demonstrated damages to favor those who are bringing the complaints. So you do have to demonstrate damages, but that's kind of the area where we're getting now is we're seeing physical damages to human health to a large center of the population, and Rebecca touched on some of those. And then the third is around the attribution science is maturing. So similarly to in climate change, scientists are now able to say, you know, this company emitted this number of greenhouse gas emissions, and these damages were created by climate change driven by greenhouse gas emissions, and that attribution or those dots are connected. And so now there are litigation cases that are around specifically holding companies accountable for like specific damages happening in the environment. And that's a similar kind of thing that is starting to unfold in the plastics litigation as well, connecting the dots between specific types of plastics that are causing toxicity. And because plastics are made up with lots of different kinds of chemicals, some of them have very unique chemical signatures and can be traced back to the producers. So we may see like an increasing number of damage related things going to specific companies for specific types of plastics that we're using. And then Rebecca, you also touched on, and this is mentioned in the report, in the value chain. So if you're a company and you're sitting in a value chain, as you are, right, there are plastics used almost in every industry. The value where you sit in the value chain influences how you are exposed to the plastics litigation, and there's nobody who's kind of like excused from that. So as Rebecca pointed out, like there are different ways depending on where you sit in the value chain for how that litigation might play out. But more details on that coming. The second is around regulatory risk, and Rebecca touched on this as well. So we're seeing an increasing number of regulations around, reducing or banning single-use plastic, banning plastic bags, banning the recycling label. There was recently a case in Arizona where a company was forced to remove the recycling label from their product and actually add a hazard warning label. So companies need to be thinking about how that's going to impact their, their products and their operations going forward as these bans come into place. The third would be around reputational risk. If you get named as one of the key plastic polluters or even sued, that could create an impact on your brand that may have an impact on your sales to consumers, but also to corporate buyers, right? So not all companies think about like a consumer-facing brand and are trying to differentiate on having a positive eco reputation, but many companies in the value chain, for companies who do care about having a positive eco reputation, they may start risking sales because those companies will want to avoid having that plastics risk in their supply chain as well. And then I guess the last type of risk that I'll talk about is around ESG risk or investor risk. So what the data have shown in the research is that investors are already pricing in risks related to climate change and risks related to biodiversity loss. So as the data become more mature and we're seeing the financial implications and the risks associated with these unfold, investors will start to price in risk exposure to plastics as well. And that may impact a company's ability to raise green financing, or they may get penalized or may not even be able to get access to certain kinds of capital if they are not managing these risks appropriately. And that will become even more important as we see the adoption of nature-related financial disclosures, a la TNFD and the CSRD, where companies have to show risks associated with different types of nature impacts, including plastics use and plastics production, and being required to publish plastics numbers in legal financial reports that could, again, level up their exposure to risks. So that doesn't encompass everything, but it certainly highlights the complexity of this issue for a corporation, especially one, if you look across a corporation, how much it uses plastic. And so I think in a later part, we'll talk about what to do about those things. But yep, that's kind of the overview on how companies can think about plastics and business risk.
Great. Thank you so much. Yeah, for the overview. There's a lot there, and a lot to think about. And so let's focus in some more on the legal aspect. So Loes, how do you see the legal landscape unfolding in relation to what Megan mentioned, and yeah, anything else you want to pull in?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's a very big question, I think. So to answer, I would have to preface that you'd have to look at the legal landscape very generally, and I can go into specific cases, but I think that's not really beneficial for this talk. So to come to the question, I think that the legal landscape is unfolding in a very recognizable way, which we kind of already also gave away with our webinar title, because we're seeing that plastics litigation is moving away from the waste management framing that it used to be, and is moving toward a mix of deception claims, product safety, health and disclosure claims. And what has become clear now is that this is happening across the three layers that you already mentioned at the start. So you have the upstream producers, which is mostly fossil fuel companies, for example. And then there's the midstream companies after that that are using plastics in their products. And then come the downstream actors that are making specific claims to consumers, for example, about recyclability. And what we see is that across all of these three levels, the claims are now moving into public nuisance. So that's tort law as well, deceptive marketing, also tort law, product liability, and even personal injury. And then that's where the health aspects come in. So what's important is that this is, and it's really interesting as well for me, is that this trajectory is not very new. It's really mirroring what we saw in asbestos litigation, tobacco, and then more recently in PFAS litigation. Because in asbestos litigation, what you could see is that it set up liability across a value chain. Once courts had accepted that companies failed to act on specific early warnings, depending, it was really case specific on what these warnings were. And then came tobacco, and they really introduced that playbook of the internal knowledge within the company. So that is public misrepresentation and what they did with that internal knowledge and the long-term health harm that was caused by their actions. And then you have PFAS that followed that kind of refined the model even further with huge settlements at the moment going on. And there, in those cases, there's a clear recognition that chemical exposure can really translate into larger scale, long-term liability. And what we see in plastic litigation specifically now is that they're following that same structure. What I mentioned with the three levels of the upstream, midstream, downstream is that there's always some overlap here and there as well between these different streams. But seeing it with these levels helps to understand where the legal framework at the moment is moving. Because at the highest level, so that's the upstream level, the fossil fuel level, the focus is on the petrochemical and fossil fuel linked companies. And the arguments there are really to do with plastic pollution not being a waste issue, but the result of a system that was designed and promoted, allegedly, despite known limitations, particularly around recyclability. So similar arguments are made at the moment in climate cases, for example, climate litigation, where lawyers are arguing that there have been these decades-long deception campaigns among fossil fuel companies to, again, allegedly steer industries in a specific direction. And then second, in the midstream layer, the attention of the cases shifts more towards product design and a failure to warn as well, especially where there's that plausible link to human exposure. Obviously, there's a huge environmental exposure, but human exposure is also where it really starts to gain the liability. And then finally, in the lower level, the downstream level, there's a huge rise in greenwashing and marketing cases that are testing what a company is telling its consumers about sustainability and safety. And there's really a wide variety of examples that we can give there. But that's really where it's happening. And that's kind of what I like to call the low-hanging fruit, because any kind of company could be engaging in that if they're dealing with plastics. So this is all, as both Rebecca and Megan mentioned, happening alongside the regulatory landscape, which is also evolving, but it's not yet settled and it's very fractured, I would say. In some jurisdictions, especially in the EU, you can see the detailed rules coming out, especially around single-use plastics or what else, chemical safety disclosure. In other jurisdictions, it's a little bit more slow or more fragmented what's going on. And I think most regulation is still dealing with that lower level of recycling and greenwashing and not really with the higher level issues that are being dealt with already in litigation. And this goes for basically any kind of topic, but here especially is that less regulation does not mean less risk. In practice, it actually means there's more risk, because when regulators step back, that leaves a gap that is not clear, and it leaves a lot of uncertainty. And it's also a gap that NGOs especially, and others as well, that have certain agendas, they love to jump into that gap. And you can see that, for example, recently in California, 2024, Attorney General files a lawsuit against ExxonMobil, and it focused on deception around recycling. So this is one of these deception campaigns. And separate case, I think it was New York. Sorry, no, this is also California. In cases against Pepsi and Coca-Cola, again, focusing on misleading sustainability narratives that are going on these company levels or industry levels. What's also interesting to add is that it's not all successful in court. Courts are also starting to show where the fault lines of these litigation cases are. So this is the New York case. It's People versus PepsiCo. There, the court dismissed the case because the theory depended way too heavily on consumer behavior. So what that means is causation is incredibly important. And Megan kind of touched on that as well with attribution theory. All of that is kind of linked. Basically coming to the end conclusion that broader system claims about consumer behavior and claims in that direction, they're kind of struggling in court, but claims that are tied to misrepresentation, omissions in communication, product design, and then most importantly, the human exposure element, those are the ones that are being successful mostly and are gaining traction, and the ones that are appealing as well to the general public and that are making their ways through the PR narratives around it. So I think that's kind of the bird's eye overview of the legal framework.
Yeah, thank you so much. That's super helpful and interesting. Oh yeah, go ahead.
I have a follow-up question to Loes on this. Sorry if this is a curveball. I'm super curious. The concept of like, if there's increasing information out there about how dangerous these products are, if you're a company who's like, well, you know, we're just using plastic, or we put plastic, but we don't manufacture the plastic, we just buy it and put it in our product, but we're not taking action on something that is increasingly known as dangerous, could that potentially create litigation risks as well? As like, you know, something's dangerous and you're not acting to protect consumers from it, and you're playing a role in proliferating it, or are they not really exposed?
I think to a certain extent they are. It's more difficult to go after that, I would say, but they are exposed because they're still knowingly, and it's one of those legal terms, right? Like the knowingly aspect of doing something, that's always something that is a very risky thing to do. So if you know something is dangerous, and it really depends very heavily on the jurisdiction that they're in. But for example, in the EU, there's a lot of laws about any kind of person, so that includes a legal person, having some sort of responsibility to protect society from a certain danger. And that would definitely fall under there. I think in the US, there's a bit more leeway, but still it's something that I would not recommend a company does anymore, especially when it comes to the lower levels. If you talk about greenwashing, for example, at that stage, they should know by now, with all of the information that is out there, what is kind of okay to say and how far you can go with say, and what you should definitely not be saying. So I think when it comes to knowledge, there's enough information out there at the moment to kind of go around this liability.
So we've touched on a few times, both Megan and Loes, and in the intro about this shift to this focus on the implications for human health. And Françoise, we've chatted about this in some of our conversations. So I think this point, I don't want it to be missed. Can you talk about that shift and what you've seen and that focus and what that means?
Yeah, for sure. Thank you, Rebecca. So when we started out at Pact to Earth in 2022, we were really focused on the environmental claims around the compostable materials that we were developing and offering to our clients. But we realized that, unfortunately, not everyone really cares that much about the environment or about climate change. Some people do, some people don't, but almost everyone cares about the health of themselves and of their families. And so the health aspects have proven to be the stronger messages when it comes to explaining to people why compostable materials are the best solution. And some of the health issues associated with fossil plastics, and typically, by the way, the health issues come from the 16,000 or so additives that are used in fossil plastic. It's the additives primarily. And some of those additives are things like phthalates, which directly impact fertility, as do bisphenols. But also PFAS, which you mentioned previously, so the forever chemicals, which are now from August of this year very highly regulated within the European Union. And also, of course, there are heavy metals, and even, you know, rPET, which is always touted as the one recycled fossil plastic that is food safe and you know, great to use. It typically contains quite high content of antimony, which is a heavy metal which has been proven to be harmful to human health. So I think, you know, whether you're using virgin fossil plastic or recycled fossil plastic, there are definitely significant health issues. And one thing I'd like to mention is, you know, you talked about the tobacco cases and asbestos cases that have come before. I would argue that the plastic issue is actually wider spread because, you know, in terms of tobacco, well, you know, not everyone smokes or is exposed to other people's smoke. In the case of asbestos, not everyone has been in direct contact with that. But even if you are an uncontacted tribe living in the Amazon, you are in contact with fossil plastic because it's in the fish that you're eating. It's being rained down on you. That there is no escape. You know, everyone on this planet is affected by fossil plastics, whether it's the microplastics and nanoplastics in the food chain, all those chemicals that we were talking about that are leaching into our food and also into our skin from cosmetics and other things like that. And just finally, I think it's interesting. A colleague of mine was putting together a presentation for a client just the other day, and he showed me this chart that he wanted to put in there. But it was interesting because it made it look, so there are all these charts on the internet that are saying that landfill, like managed landfill sites, are properly disposed waste. And so that there's this huge movement to try to argue that anything that goes into a managed landfill site is properly disposed waste. And it seems incredible to me, you know, if you think that 79% of plastic ends up either in landfill or in the great outdoors, to try to claim that burying it in the ground is actually a good way to manage it. It kind of defies belief.
Yeah, especially when you think about plastic production tripling in the next 30 years or 35 years, like, yeah, that's really hard to believe. But yeah, those are some really sobering facts, and it really speaks to the level of the crisis, for sure. Well, let's start to move into thinking about managing risks and solutions. So to do that, I'm going to do a second poll. I'll start that now. About what do you think is the biggest barrier to companies switching away from petroplastics? The options here are the cost of alternatives, performance and functionality, lack of regulatory pressure, inertia and organizational resistance, or other. And there wasn't an option to enter your answer here. So if you have other and you want to put it in the Q&A, we'd be very curious to see what those other barriers are. So we'll give that a little bit of time for people to fill out, and yeah, and we'll see what the answers are. Actually, maybe we'll let people keep filling that out while we go to our next question, thinking about managing these risks. So yeah, Megan, let's go back to you. What can be done to start managing these risks?
This is my favorite part because this is where innovation comes in, and as a technologist and an innovator, to me, when I look at something like the plastics crisis or the climate crisis or the biodiversity crisis, whatever is the crisis that we're doing, it's an opportunity for us to reinvent, to redefine, to evolve, right? So we can actually get to a place where we're using plastic in an optimal way, not a maximal way. Similarly, we can re-architect our industries to align social and environmental outcomes with financial outcomes. All of this is possible. It's just a matter of will, and it's a matter of mindset around how to address a crisis. Like, is a crisis a problem to be fought against or something to be embraced and figure out like what's the future of where we're going? On a little side note, I recently was reading a book about change and how change can impact your life and how people deal with changes to their lives, like things that happen to them, like a severe illness or loss of the family member or something like that. And there was this, the guidance from the book was, if you try to hold on to the old way that you were and go back to that, you are going to struggle with the change. But if you accept like the realities and look forward to who you're going to become or who you're going to evolve to, that is the best way to get through a transition period. And I think that psychologically, that's important for a person dealing with an individual issue, but I think collectively, it's also a good learning for how we can embrace a crisis like the plastics crisis. So as an individual company or an industry, like, this is a great opportunity to look at who are we becoming, like what is the service that, or the, I would think less about products, but more about like the service, and the products are in service of the service. Like, what utility do we bring? What value do we add to society, to our customers? And then think about how can we redefine that or restructure that in a way that has a much better outcome for them, for the environment, for society, and human health at large. So we spend most of our time looking at kind of like biodiversity and nature and how do you protect ecosystems, and plastics is a huge component of that. But when you're setting a biodiversity target, for example, the Science-Based Targets Network recommends this AR3T approach, which is avoid, reduce, regenerate, restore, and transform. So I've hijacked that a little bit into the AR3T for plastic. And it's a great hierarchy as well to think about and look across how you use or make plastic in your organization, starting with the A, avoid. So where is the low-hanging fruit where you can just stop using plastic? An example, I was in the supermarket one day. If you've ever challenged yourself to go to the supermarket and not buy plastic, it's a super impossible thing to do. Like, plastic is so everywhere and it's there unnecessarily. Like, there was a 2-for-1 deal on butter, and the butter was wrapped in a foil packaging, but then the two were stuck together with a piece of plastic. I'm like, here's a piece of plastic that's going to last 1,000 years just to make someone buy 2 butters. There's other ways that you can make people buy 2 butters, right? That plastic is not necessary. So one of the first things you can do is just look across and say, where do we actually not need plastic here? Because it's not really adding any value. We just stuck it in there because it's cheap and because it made something super easy. Like, that to me is a low-hanging fruit of something that could be addressed. Second is reduce, AR, 3 Rs. Reduce is how can we just reduce plastics in, you know, what we're doing or what we're selling, right? So then you see companies like reducing the plastic content in bottles, or you know, just like redesigning the packaging so that net it uses less plastic. Third, the second R is around recycling. Not only can you look to, if you need to use plastic that can be recycled easily in public facilities, or that you create a circular program to bring that plastic back into your company and you can recycle it and reuse it within your company. And then the third would be, the third R would be replace. And here's where we get into like bioplastics and alternate materials. Again, like if you replace with paper, you replace with another kind of material, you still want to reduce, like we still want to reduce that flow of throwaway components. But if you need to have that, if like literally plastic is the only thing that's going to solve this, is there a more bio-friendly version of plastic that you can put into that spot? And then lastly, the T is transform. How can you transform and change your business model so that you can serve the utility without the throwaway component of the vehicle that carries the thing that you're looking to do, right? So we see a lot of, well, I started buying a face wash that comes in a bar form and it comes in a simple paper box, right? Versus the one that came in a plastic pump before. But even you can buy bar soaps without any packaging on it at all, right? So it's just an example, but there's a lot of innovation, a lot of opportunity to be discovered here and explored. And we talked about this, I think, in a previous webinar around innovation. Like, employees really love the innovation aspect of their work, especially if they're innovating for a good cause. And so we see that in other industries where they're looking at, like, okay, how do we reduce our carbon footprint? Let's innovate a new product or evolve our product to have a lower carbon footprint. You can apply the same to everything, to land use, to plastics use, to finding new plastic materials, to finding new ways of using biomaterials to, serve packaging functions and things like this. So in summary, I think there's an enormous opportunity for new ideas, new businesses, for businesses to transform that have a multi-benefit of reducing risk for the business, which ends in, like, ultimately reducing cost to the business and creating more opportunities for the business in a, sustainable, regenerative economy.
Yes, love that. The AR3T for plastic. That's awesome. Françoise, can you also add to that in terms of what can be done to manage the risk, but also the opportunities, and how Pack to Earth, like, how that is an opportunity as well?
Sure. Yeah. So I think that some of the listeners probably to this webinar are going to be feeling a little bit conflicted right now. And I completely get why a lot of people in the big corporations, and smaller corporations, have been working really, really hard to replace some of their packaging with materials that are either recycled or can be recycled. And people listening are probably thinking, well, that doesn't, they're realizing it doesn't actually solve the health issues, the fertility issues, doesn't necessarily reduce the risk on the health front. And so they're probably feeling a tiny bit conflicted there, and I fully sympathize. I think a lot of people have tried to make those changes with the very best intentions in the world, but it's unfortunately not actually solving the problem. So clearly I am biased because, I'm the CEO of a bioplastics company, and so you should take that into account. But I really do feel like, in the context of the regulation, the different regulations which are coming out in the European Union, for example, the general market trend is towards more and more compostables. It's taken a while, and it's taken a lot longer than we thought. And we found that in the different deliberations over the PPWR legislation, a lot of the regulations that were going to come in around promoting compostable materials have got diluted because of the very strong oil and gas lobby. But still, some in the February 2025 PPWR, some uses have been mandated for compostables, simple things like fruit stickers and things like that. And the general expectation is that in 2028 there will be an amendment to the PPWR that will be very favorable to compostables. That's what we're hearing from people who are involved in some of those negotiations. And I think, very importantly, we touched on earlier the PFAS limitations, which are coming into play in August 2026. So, in just a few months' time. And basically what those say is that you cannot have PFAS content in food contact packaging above certain levels. And those certain levels are so truly tiny that it means that you can't really use recycled fossil plastic unless potentially it's rPET, which you can get without PFAS in it. But if you can imagine, most recycled fossil plastic, gets mixed up, in the recycling process. Lots of different kinds of plastic from lots of different uses, whether it's agriculture, food, medical, household, they all get mixed together. And so there is PFAS contamination across anything that's not a kind of closed loop recycling in fossil plastic. And so there's this contradiction, if you like, in the PPWR, where it's saying on the one hand, hey, companies, you need to use more recycled material in your packaging, but at the same time it's saying, but you can't really use it unless maybe it's our pet, because at least in food contact packaging, because it's going to have too high a content of PFAS. So I think there are quite a few different things that need to be sorted out. We do expect some of those gray areas to become a lot clearer over the next couple of years, and we are seeing a very clear shift towards compostables. And when we first started out and we started trying to get clients for our materials, honestly, it was very, very hard. And now suddenly we're finding that every time we go to a show, the interest in our materials is extraordinarily high, and things are completely different from how they were in 2022. And there are a lot of companies who are in the European Union that basically ignoring what it says in the PPWR, and they're using compostable materials on a very wide range of applications anyway, just because they feel it's the right thing to do.
Wow, that's great. Thank you so much for that. For all those additional points. There is one question in the Q&A, which I want to get to in a minute, but just to, I guess, wrap up this section, for companies that are just waking up to this issue, we're just starting to think about it. And this is open to any of the panelists. What do you think are the most important things they can do right now to get started or to get ahead of it?
I can jump in. So I think the first is to assess your level of exposure to what I'll call plastics risk. So you should start, if you're not already measuring, even if you're not ready to disclose this information, you should be measuring it internally, like understand how much and of what types of plastics and where you use in your organization and what applications, and then do like a life cycle assessment on that to figure out like where are those plastics going. Are they coming back into the economy, or are they going into the environment? Are they contributing? Are they the kind of chemicals that are known to contribute to human health? So I think the first step is benchmarking the exposure. And usually once you get an idea of that, then it leads you down the priority rabbit holes of what to do about it. So doing that first benchmarking can then help you identify where you have legal exposure, reputational exposure. If you simulate like, hey, we've just uncovered this information internally, what does it look like if we publish it externally? Like what kind of a reaction will we get? Like that's stuff that you want to start addressing immediately. Because if, let's say, the next year or the year after you do have to start disclosing that information, you want to have already been acting on the insights that you got from that risk assessment. So, of course, like Françoise said, we are a risk assessment company, so we're also biased, but that's generally how we see customers using our platform as the starting point to do a risk assessment across the business, not just plastics, but there's a number of like new nature-related financial risks that companies are being expected to understand and address. So I think the first step is doing the benchmarking to figure out where you are. And that usually leads you to where the priorities should be, which leads you to how you should address them.
Thank you. Yeah, does anyone else want to add? Or is that a good place to start? Okay.
Sorry, I could maybe add that from my perspective, I would keep track of the litigation, especially because with plastics, it's very similar in nature to climate litigation, where there's, aside from the attorney generals, for example, or the government agencies that are looking at this, the NGOs are all collaborating across the world, basically. So if you see, even if your jurisdiction for now is like there's no cases, there's nothing to do with plastics, at some point, these cases that are happening in one jurisdiction, they're pretty easily replicated across different jurisdictions, and they're actively trying to do that as well. So what is happening in, let's say, Arizona right now might be happening in New York tomorrow, and what is happening in Japan right now might be happening in the Netherlands tomorrow. So they're working on doing that. So I think that's why it's valuable to keep up with what litigation is doing. Also because litigation, once you get through for me interesting, but for most people, the boring parts of the laws and everything, you can actually, it's kind of like learning by trial and error. It's just not your trial and error. Someone else is making these mistakes and you can still learn from it. So that's why it's good to learn from it as well, and to follow it and to see what's being said and what a court is saying about it and what kind of science is being used. And so there's a lot of valuable information there.
Yeah, that's a really good point. So addressing it both from the company within, looking at doing the risk assessment and doing that internal exploration, but also seeing and learning from what's happening right now throughout the globe.
And
Yeah.
I would argue that potentially there are companies out there too who, like we were at the beginning, who are very focused on the environmental aspects of their packaging, but maybe not so much on the health aspects. So it could be that there's a whole new area that they need to look at there.
Yes, that's a really great point.
I think that also makes a great case within the business. So if you're like a sustainability manager and you're trying to get your organization to care about this, going and pulling on not only the litigation cases, but the health aspects might be a way to bridge that gap. So that's a great point, Françoise.
Yeah. So one question in the Q&A, Loes, if you could take this one, could court cases be filed if there's no law in place to base litigation cases?
Yeah, the answer is yes. What they're using is existing pieces of law. So for example, tort law that is saying about deception. So you have deception is you're just doing something to mislead another person. And that is a very general piece of law that pretty much any jurisdiction will have something like that. That if you do A and it harms another person, then you can be liable. And every single jurisdiction across the world will have something like that. And what they're doing in these cases is they're using that general regulation and they're applying that to very novel situations. So here that's plastics, it can be climate, it can be biodiversity, but they are basically building their own legal framework by relying on things that have existed for dozens or even hundreds of years in certain jurisdictions and just kind of reinventing it and reusing it. So that can be any kind of law at the moment. So the consumer deception cases are based on, like I said, deception, but there's also the public nuisance that I just mentioned, which is a tort law system where you just want to simplify it, one individual person, legal person, a company, anyone is doing something that is negatively affecting a larger group of people. That's it, all it is in essence. And they're just applying that to plastics cases. And then the second element to that is that it's not just that these laws are everywhere already. It's also, like I just mentioned, that these cases are being replicated pretty easily across jurisdictions. And then thirdly, one interesting thing that I was just thinking about is also in climate litigation, you can see a lot of the transnational cases where, for example, there's a specific harm being suffered in, let's say, Pakistan, and they're now starting to hold companies in the UK, in the Netherlands, potentially even in the US, liable for what is being done in other countries as well. So if you're looking at recycling, for example, I've seen photos of the environment in Kenya where they are pretty much digging clothes into the earth and using it as kind of just to prevent flooding. But they're getting so many of our clothes in Africa, in African countries, and we're thinking that we're donating them, but it's just leading to this huge waste crisis in Africa. And things like that, like they're being put directly into the ground because they don't have any other use for it. So at some point, I do think that there is going to come something regarding that in the fashion industry where these companies are going to be held liable for the complete lack of possibility to recycle in that regard.
There was a case in Italy, right, where 11 executives were given 17 years of prison over PFAS pollution before PFAS were regulated.
Yeah, that's another area that's super interesting is director's duties and like fiduciary duty, if you're more into the financial space as well, is that very quickly can go, they're trying to make that go towards the criminal space. So it's not just civil litigation anymore, but even if you're acting on behalf of a company and you're making certain decisions, and again, you go towards that level of knowledge that you have, even as an individual, like should you know better than to make a specific decision and have the company go in that direction? what they're trying to do in civil society is to hold these individuals liable, criminally liable. So that means fines, but prison terms, everything in that regard as well. And that is something that they're really going towards. And again, with plastics, it's just easier to do that than with climate, because you have something tangible to show that there is that pollution. It's not just some sort of greenhouse gas that's in the air somewhere and it's coming from somewhere. But with plastics, they with the scientific developments that they have, they can really pinpoint where it's coming from as well, and which company is related to it. And so it's a lot easier for them to start proving their claims.
Yeah, and I think when people mostly think about PFAS at the moment, they're thinking about the Teflon in frying pans and things like that, and the Dark Waters documentary. And probably some people are thinking, well, you know, how are PFAS getting into my packaging? But it's the same kind of principle, you know, just as PFAS are used on frying pans to make them non-stick. In the case of packaging, they're used often for grease resistance. So, for example, you know, hamburger packaging, the grease-proof paper that's under the hamburger may well have PFAS in it to provide that grease resistance. So it's a similar thing. And just to mention one more quick thing, there have been a lot of instances where companies have made claims around, for example, not including bisphenol A, so BPA, for example, in their packaging, and also other chemicals that are known to cause human health effect, and they've just been substituting them for something similar. So for a different kind of bisphenol, or for, you know, a different kind of chemical that basically has the, you know, very similar effects, but it just has a slightly different name. So they're avoiding that specific piece of legislation. But to Loes's point, you know, I don't think it would really get them off the hook in a court of law.
I've always wondered about that. I just had that sneaking suspicion. There's something else in there. It's like whack-a-mole anyway. We are just about at our time. I wanted to publish the results from the biggest barrier to companies switching away from petroplastics, and it was mostly lack of regulatory pressure. We had one last poll that I'm going to start asking if you would be interested in being contacted by any of us. And I'm also going to put up our emails. I'll share my screen again. So you have those available. And I really want to thank everyone for attending. Thank you so much for all of our panelists, which I found to be a super informative conversation, and may it inspire a lot more action in this arena. Yeah, and thank you for joining. Again, we're going to share the recording afterwards. You can also find the link to the article about plastics, the new asbestos, here and also in that email. And yeah, we look forward to seeing you the next time.
Thank you so much. Nice to be here.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Mhm.